After a brief hiatus, we're back with another episode of Critical History. Today we will take a few minutes to talk about the Bolshevik Revolution. No, not the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. Let's go through the basics. Who, what, when, where, and why. Who? The Bolsheviks, your run-of-the-mill communist revolutionaries. What? A communist revolution. When? October 1917. Where? Across much of Western Russia. Why? That's a good question. The answer would probably depend on who you ask. A Russian peasant farmer would probably give you a very different answer than Comrade Lenin, Trotsky, or Stalin would. So, where do we begin? Well, here's something interesting. Did you know that Bolshevik means majority? And even though they called themselves the majority, the Bolsheviks were actually a minority? Now, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in October 1917, but it was actually the second revolution in Russia that year. The first happened in February, the so-called February Revolution. And to further confuse matters, it actually happened in March. It's a bit of a long story. Basically, Russia's involvement in World War I, also known as the Great War, also known as the War to End All Wars, caused a lot of hardship. There was already a great deal of social inequality before the war, and the conflict brought everything to a boil. Now, this is a quote in regards to the February Revolution, and Wikipedia quotes Mark Steinberg, a historian, as saying, "The revolution appeared to break out without any real leadership or formal planning." Right. Because if there's one thing I know about revolutions, it's that they just happen. The Tsar's troops in St. Petersburg desert him, and he ends up abdicating. There'd already been an attempted revolution in 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War, but it was put down rather forcefully. In a lot of ways, the suppression of the 1905 revolution ended up leading to the later revolutions. But these matters are far from simple. There are allegations that outside forces were promoting discord and attempting to subvert their society, culture, and values. What we would call these days the spread of Western democratic ideals by political activists. In order to boost the morale of the troops, the Tsar went to the front lines in order to lead the troops himself. However, this meant the Tsarina was in charge back in St. Petersburg, and this is where the infamous Rasputin comes in. Now, there are a lot of different opinions on Rasputin, probably enough to do an episode on him alone. But one of the interesting ones I heard was that Rasputin was capable of hypnotism. The reason you hear so many scandalous stories about him, though, is because after the Tsar was deposed, there was a massive media campaign to tarnish his legacy. And one of the ways to do this was, of course, to accuse the Tsarina of adultery. Now, notice I said the Tsar abdicated. Not that he was murdered or deposed, rather, he abdicated. He and his entire family, his wife and 5 young children, were murdered later. We'll get to that. A few weeks after his abdication, the new government surrenders to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which created the nations of Belarus, Ukraine, and Finland. The land of Poland was ceded. At this point, America hadn't even entered the war. But as soon as Russia surrenders and Germany is able to completely focus on the Western Front, Congress votes to enter the war. Woodrow Wilson famously campaigned on keeping America out of the war, and he was re-elected on that promise, only to do a 180 a few months into his second term. Now we get to the interesting stuff. When the Tsar abdicated, Leon Trotsky, one of the leading Bolsheviks, was actually in New York City. He was writing articles for Russian and Yiddish newspapers in the city. So once he heard about the successful February Revolution, he headed back to Russia. Off the coast of Canada, his boat was stopped and he was detained by British intelligence. Allegedly, pressure from peasant councils forced the Russian foreign minister of the provisional government to demand his release. And if you believe that, one of the difficulties in discussing history is you never quite know where to begin, or what to explore in further depth. A good case could be made for the Bolshevik Revolution to have had its roots in the Europe-wide revolutions of 1848, or even earlier, during the rise of Napoleon. It's a long story. So what about Leon Trotsky? Some people may have never even heard of him. Well, let's just say he was every bit as important in the rise of communism as Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin. Although these days he's best remembered for being murdered via ice pick in Mexico some 23 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. On the orders of Joseph Stalin, of course. I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make with the Bolshevik Revolution is to look at it in isolation. So it looks like we will have to revisit the topic in the future to cover all aspects, such as factors that led to it or its connection to Germany's Spartacus uprising. In keeping with this channel's focus, though, is the idea of how history is rewritten. We will have to take a look at the origin stories of Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky and their assorted mysteries in the future. Where were we? Ah yes, the February Revolution that actually happened in March 1917. After which Vladimir Lenin got on a sealed train from Zurich and Trotsky got on a ship from New York City and headed back to Russia in order to carry out the Bolshevik Revolution. This made the job of the Bolsheviks much easier, as all they had to do was oust the provisional government, which they did by bribing soldiers to defect and with the use of Red Guards, volunteer paramilitary, or what we would perhaps call these days, I don't know, moderate rebels? They occupied government buildings by force and the next day seized the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. These days, historians like to say that the Bolsheviks had the support of the majority of the populace, but I would like to point out that similar to many modern elections, there was a major difference between what the people were promised and what was actually delivered. For example, the Bolshevik slogan was "All power to the Soviets." Soviet means council, and the Soviets were meant to be democratically elected local councils. I think we all know how that turned out. Russia was still ruled by autocrats. The only difference is now they were communists instead of czars. By 1920, a little over 2 years after the revolution, free elections to the councils were halted, and members were simply appointed. Speaking of having the supposed support of the majority, a few weeks after the revolution, the promised elections were held for members of the Constituent Assembly. But the Bolsheviks only won about a quarter of the 700 seats. The Socialist Revolutionary Party won more. Well, the Constituent Assembly met all of one time for 1 day before it was dissolved. It was basically at this point, early 1918, that Russians realized that a bait and switch had occurred. The Russian Civil War kicked off as a result, and it lasted for the better part of 5 years, only ending in 1922 at the cost of an estimated 7 million to 12 million civilian casualties. Now I hear you asking, if the Bolsheviks didn't have popular support, then how did they manage to recruit enough soldiers to win the Civil War? This is the sort of thing leftists love to gloss over, if not ignore outright. Trotsky instituted mandatory conscription of rural peasants and forced compliance by taking hostages, in other words family members, and killing them if necessary. The history books justify this by saying that the White Army, who the Bolsheviks were fighting against, did the same thing. Now, as grim as all this is exactly why the study of history is so important, in my opinion. It teaches you what actual evil looks like, and let's face it, it is usually way beyond what we can imagine. Also keep in mind that the Bolsheviks had come to power by telling the rural peasants what they wanted to hear, not by saying, there's going to be a civil war in which your participation will be mandatory, or else we will kill your wife and children. During the Civil War itself, Trotsky actually used the troops with the best equipment, machine guns, as blocking troops. That's a euphemism for, if you retreat, we will shoot you ourselves. I'm sorry, but this is starting to sound an awful lot like a genocide of Russia's youth. Either fight and kill our enemies, or we kill you, or barring that, your family. Now, there's a lot to discuss in terms of the details, but I want to end on one final point. There's a famous Winston Churchill quote where he said that Bolshevism must be strangled in its cradle. Well, Winston, you already had Trotsky in an internment camp in Nova Scotia before the Bolshevik Revolution even started. The last point I wanted to cover is the execution of the Tsar, Tsarina, and their children. The murder of the Romanovs. 5 children, 4 of them daughters. Rather than provide the grim details of their assassination, I want to focus on this. The people of Russia were not told of their execution. Rather, they were told that the Tsar had been killed, but that his wife and children were safe. To quote the official press release translated, Nicholas Romanov's wife and son have been sent to a secure place. In 1922, 4 years after the fact, the Bolsheviks, by now called the Soviets, were denying outright that the Tsar's family were dead. This is actually where the whole story of Anastasia comes from. If you're old enough to remember, there was a cartoon made about it in the late 90s by 20th Century Fox, where they paint Rasputin as the bad guy, who's out to kill pure little Anastasia. Now that sounds to me like someone forgot to do their homework during history class. Discussion regarding the fate of the family was suppressed even during Stalin's reign, so that means even through around 1953, the people of Russia still weren't being told the truth about what happened to the royal family. Why do I mention this? Because this is a classic example of how history is rewritten. We all know that the Bolsheviks murdered the Romanovs, and yet, for over 30 years afterwards, this fact was suppressed. That they suppressed it should tell you everything you need to know about what the Russian people would have thought about it had they known the truth. Propaganda had turned many against the Tsar, but from what I could tell, it was enough for them that he abdicate. They didn't want to see him, his wife, their young children all brutally murdered. Did I mention they also killed their dogs? Believe me when I say I'm sparing you some truly sordid details. Just like the release of Trotsky from the British internment camp, responsibility for the murder of the Romanovs was directed in the general direction of the Soviets, the People's Councils. Just like the release of Trotsky from the British internment camp, responsibility for the murder of the Romanovs was directed in the general direction of the Soviets, the People's Councils. What did we learn today? Well, we learned how history can be used to put a gloss over the most sordid deeds of the past, or to amplify positive events. How it can be used to shift blame or attribute responsibility, like the British shifting blame for the release of Trotsky or Lenin shifting blame for the murder of the Romanovs. We also learned how the most manipulative liars in the world operate. Not by telling small white lies, but rather inverting the truth entirely, such as by claiming that the Tsarina and her children were being kept safe. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe, and check out my book, Conquest of Truth, available as an ebook now. And until next time, remember to stay critical.